And it's a great pleasure to invite Bill Barnett back onto our Zoom. And Bill, of course, from C9 Hotel Works. And we've brought Bill online to discuss the rather strange situation we have in places like Phuket, Pattaya and Samui, which have been decimated by the lack of tourists. This week we had the Prime Minister and a coterie of cabinet ministers visit Phuket and Samui. Bill, what can we expect after that meeting?
From what we've seen so far, we're not expecting a lot. I mean, it was quite political in terms of that event. I think probably the biggest disappointment for us is that the political and the private sector aren't meeting together really in terms of initiatives, in terms of that. We've got policies, but the policies, we didn't really see any positive, great outcomes or game changers from those meetings. So I think that's probably the biggest disappointment.
Well, yeah, they were talking about putting committees together to study things, to look at possible plans in the future. It seems to me that they can talk until they're blue in the face, but until we actually get tourists on the ground, nothing's going to improve.
I mean, let's have a quick lesson in math. I mean, Phuket has about 9 million arrivals at Phuket International Airport in 2019. Majority, in terms of the high season arrivals from October to March, April, that represents 5 to 6 million people in terms of that. Effectively, as Phuket's coming into a high season, they're very reliant upon that income for the island. 1 out of every 2 people in Phuket somehow tourism touches. What we're seeing is right now, in September, the volume through Phuket International Airport was about 121,000 people for the month, okay? That's about 4,000 people a day. Yeah. And we've got over 90,000 hotel rooms. So you can do the math and understand the issue, in terms of that. We can't survive on domestic tourism. We can't survive on cheaper airfares. We can't survive with Thais only coming to Phuket. There's not enough.
Now, Phuket and Samui are in a particularly bad situation because they're both pretty much fed by traffic through the airports. And at the moment, Phuket International Airport's only open for domestic tourists. Same at Samui.
I think the interesting thing we've seen is, arbitrarily, is that we've seen the Maldives reopen for tourism. We've even been talking to people in Zanzibar, which is one of the big resort markets off the coast of Africa. They've got the Russians coming there for the winter. Now, ideally, the Maldives is finding a way, saying if they set up with countries which are not having large COVID outbreaks, they're able to manage it. So for us, we're kind of at a loss about the ALSQ, because we have ALSQ. Right now, there's 17 hotels approved in Phuket, about 21 pending, but tourists can't come to Phuket directly from overseas. So it doesn't seem, so kind of a moot point at this point.
Yeah, why do they go to all the trouble of becoming ALSQ registered and qualified, yet they've got no one to look after?
Well, I think that's the messaging. We can the TAT also issues in terms of the guidance of what they're getting from the government. So in terms of that, so when they put out things with the STB coming and everything else, there's hope. Everybody wants to hope, but there's also reality too. And I think the hotels in Bangkok are finding out very quickly. We've looked at STR data for Bangkok and greater. For open hotels, occupancy is about 25-26% across the board in terms of international level hotels. In Phuket, it's sub 10%. So that certainly is a concern. So there's not, even with the ASQ hotels in Bangkok, there simply is not enough market to feed the industry, even to get near break even.
Bill, I mean, what's the mood amongst some of these big companies? These are companies that have been feeding the tourist industry and the hospitality industry for decades. How long can they actually survive? How long can they hang on? Because that's the situation we're in at the moment. They're just hanging on.
I think it's enormously frustrating. And I think what's going to happen is we're now into November, and with November, we're saying we've lost the season effectively. And what we're trying to understand from a business standpoint is next year is probably a gap year. We're not going to see tourism come in real numbers till 2022. So I think hotels and businesses here are reevaluating what they have to do to survive 2021. That's that's the year of survivor. For us, it's going to get worse till it gets better. Because I said again, within that category of high season, you've got 4 or 5 million tourists who come during that time. But once we get back into May of next year, again, we're not going to see traffic. So that's really it's desperate measures. I think we're not seeing the government address those desperate measures. We're not seeing the green lanes. We've seen Singapore being able to address that now with Hong Kong. We're seeing the Maldives open to certain markets. So we're really not seeing proactive. Tourism has to learn to live with the virus. Tourism learned to live with terrorism. That's the nearest thing that we've seen in the past. They have to coexist. We don't have a vaccine right now. And without trying to find a way to coexist with tourism and together with COVID, we're not going to make it through this.
So some of the small and the medium hotels, medium-sized hotels, they're in a particularly bad situation because they don't have the capital in the bank. There's no use opening up for 10 or 20% occupancy because they've got to sort of wind up the air conditioning system. They've got to get cleaners back in. There's just no value in it for them.
I think that's, again, we go back to about 90,000, over 90,000 hotel keys, about 1,700 hotels in Phuket. And the problem in any crisis is when there's limited demand, demand goes to the top. Right now, you can come to Phuket and get a 5-star hotel for 3-star prices. Who gets crushed are the small guys and the 3- and 4-star hotels. Most of the hotels sit in that category. So that's really where the dramatic trauma is right now. And I think really when you come to Phuket, we can drive around and say it's kind of okay. It's not okay because it's the hidden stories. It's the minimum wage earners. It's understanding that tourism, really touches 1 out of every 2 people on this island. Without tourism, these people are not going to have money.
Yeah, it's funny, on an island like Phuket, one half of the island where a lot of the locals and the bigger businesses live, life is sort of back to normal. But you go over to the west coast where you've got Patong and Kata, Karon, Surin and all the beaches, there's nobody there.
Yeah, I mean, I assure you, things are not okay. I mean, that's we can gloss that over, but it's not a good situation. I think at one point, we understand. I mean, probably the most bizarre circumstance of the week was having Emirates arrive. In terms of when the cabinet was here, we had an Emirates plane arrive, which was an international flight, but it came via Bangkok and it came empty. So that was pretty much lip service, and from our standpoint. It was a great photo opportunity, and again, we're living in a time of Instagram. So great Instagram photo. We had an empty Emirates plane here. But I think if we look at airlift, something that's really concerning us from the tourism business, also as Thai Airways, you've seen the 34 planes going up for auction off as well, and that's going to leave a real void in the market because again, tourists can only stay there if they can get here. And I think coming out of this crisis or anything forward, we need airlift again, and that's the biggest concern for Phuket.
So you've got the government on one hand saying that they want to try and reboot the tourism industry and they want the tourists to come back to Thailand, although exactly who that might be at the moment is another question. But at the same time, they're not showing any signs of lifting the ban on general tourism.
We're seeing a fractionalized outlook. We're hearing the quarantine's going to 10 days. We hear the STV is coming, but again, the STV really was suited for a place like Phuket or Koh Samui because we have winter tourists who wouldn't mind sitting in quarantine in Phuket or Samui for 2 weeks, but they're not going to sit in a 25 square meter room in Bangkok for 2 weeks for their holiday if they're coming from the snow. So that's not going to happen. But
the whole STV, you've got now a month in operation, and some 300 or 400 tourists have come.
Sure. And I think the bigger concern is that when I was saying that we should have less tourists, but we don't have any tourists, so it doesn't really matter. But the whole point about having quality right now, we have 90,000 hotel rooms. Those rooms have to be filled. If we want to change the tourism profile, that's a long-term sustainable thing. And I think my point always goes back in that Phuket really needs to become a special administrative zone, similar to Pattaya City, similar to Bangkok. There has to be a long-term tourism plan. This is not a Band-Aid. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a shark bite when you're bleeding to death. It's not going to help because there has to be a long-term solution. I agree that the economy has to be mitigated and we have to have other things, but that requires long-term planning. And we're not seeing anything long-term right now.
Well, none of these talks are going to help the people who are just struggling to pay off their bank loans or they're struggling to feed their families. They've lost all their employees. I mean, the amount of destruction that's been done, and for good reason, is incalculable. And so most of these people are never going to come back to run their hotels again. They're just going to remain abandoned.
Sure, and I think also is the impact upcountry, because you had a lot of people who were working in Phuket who would send money to the other provinces. This doesn't just impact Phuket. This is a Thai problem. This is a Thailand problem, because the number of workers in Phuket who have left Phuket now and gone back to their homes, who are going to survive on subsistence living, it's a great step backwards in terms of that, because they're back to their agricultural areas, they're back to subsistence living, and they can't send money back to their things. That's going to impact education. It's going to impact really progress. So I think economically, it's a real concern right now going forward, and how are we going to get through this? But I do understand that the political agenda is colliding with the economic agenda right now. Until those forces figure it out, nothing's going to be done here in Phuket, right?
Yeah, well, Phuket and Samui, of course, are islands, and in some ways they can be treated separately from the rest of Thailand, and they can be operated in such a way to mitigate any spread of COVID-19 beyond those particular zones. But for some reason, they're not even looking at those two islands, which have got the biggest problem, in any way different from the rest of the country.
Which I think, we can learn from what Singapore is doing with the green lanes, with their Hong Kong flights. Now, Singapore is an island. Again, going back in terms of that, in terms of that, the Maldives is functioning. We see places like Zanzibar, which is functioning now. So again, but I think the bigger concern is, like terrorism, we learned to live with tourism. We learned to live with terrorism. We took our shoes off at the airport for a long time. We learned to deal with it. It still killed people, during that time, but we had to come to terms with it. I think we have to understand, with no vaccine, that if we're going to have an economic, have any kind of economy here with tourism, we have to learn to live with COVID.
Yeah. Bill, thank you very much. We'll keep in contact with you to follow things as they go. It seems to be constantly changing. See what happens with the STV, if they make any changes to that. In the meantime, keep smiling, and we appreciate your time.
We remain optimistic, and there's as I said, there's nowhere else I'd be rather than Phuket. It's a great coming into high season, at least seeing great weather. But again, if you want to travel to Phuket, please.
Enjoy the beaches all by yourself.
I think I will be. Take care, Tim.
That was Bill Barnett there from C9hotelworks.com. This is the Thaiger.